The Creature from Jekyll Island by G. Edward Griffin. Picture this. It's a freezing November night in 1910. The New Jersey railway station sits nearly deserted, with just a handful of last-minute travelers rushing to escape the biting wind and the first dancing snowflakes. But something strange is happening at the far end of the platform. A single, magnificent railway car sits there, gleaming black with polished brass handrails. The shades are drawn tight, but through the open door you catch a glimpse of rich mahogany panels, velvet drapes, and plush armchairs. The smell of expensive cigars drifts out into the cold air. This private car doesn't have a number. It has a name, Aldrich. Senator Nelson Aldrich of Rhode Island is one of the most powerful men in Washington. He's an associate of the legendary banker J.P. Morgan, and his daughter is married to John D. Rockefeller, Jr. He is, for all practical purposes, the political voice of Wall Street itself. One by one, under cover of darkness, several more men arrive. They've been instructed to come separately to avoid reporters, and if they happen to see each other, to pretend they're strangers. Once aboard, they're to use only first names. Not even the staff knows everyone's identity. As the train pulls away, something odd happens. It makes a sudden, unexpected stop, reverses direction, and picks up one last car before continuing south. Riding in that final car are 7 men who, collectively, represent roughly 1/4 of the total wealth of the entire planet. They're on a secret journey to a private island off the Georgia coast, Jekyll Island. They've told the world they're going duck hunting. But ducks aren't what they're after. They're hunting something far, far bigger. They're going to create a creature, one that would reshape history and fundamentally alter the life of every single person listening to me right now. That creature is the Federal Reserve System. The book we're exploring today is The Creature from Jekyll Island by G. Edward Griffin. This isn't merely a finance book. It's a detective story. It's sold millions of copies and been called one of the most important books on world affairs you'll ever read. Griffin is a master researcher and documentary filmmaker who spent years investigating some of the world's most challenging topics, from the politics of cancer therapy to the secret world of international banking. And in this book, he unveils one of the biggest secrets of all, the truth about where our money actually comes from. By the end of our time together, you'll understand the hidden machinery driving our economy. You'll learn the secret of how money is created from nothing, why we have endless economic booms and busts, why we seem trapped in perpetual debt, and even why nations go to war. This is the story of history's most blatant and most brilliant scam, and it's a story that affects you, your family, and your future, more than you can possibly imagine. So let's begin the journey. To really understand the creature born on Jekyll Island, we first need to ask a deceptively simple question, one so basic that most of us never think to ask it. What is money? Seems straightforward, right? It's the paper in your wallet, the coins in your pocket, the numbers in your bank account. But what gives it value? Why do we accept a piece of paper in exchange for our hard work, our time, our creations? For thousands of years, the answer was simple. Money was something with real, intrinsic value. In ancient times, it might have been cattle, salt, or grain. These things were useful in themselves. You could eat the cow, season your food with the salt. This was called commodity money. Eventually, societies discovered that certain metals worked even better. They didn't spoil, they were easy to divide, and they were rare enough to be valuable in small quantities. Gold and silver became the kings of commodity money. They were valuable not because a government decreed it, but because people everywhere desired them for jewelry, industry, and their beauty. A gold coin was a storehouse of value. The coin itself was the value. Then came a brilliant innovation. Carrying heavy bags of coins was inconvenient and risky. So people began depositing their gold with trusted goldsmiths who had strong vaults. In return, the goldsmith would give them a paper receipt saying something like, "This paper is good for 1 ounce of gold, payable to the bearer on demand." This was the birth of receipt money. The paper itself wasn't valuable. But what it represented was, as long as everyone trusted the goldsmith would honor his receipts and return their gold on request, these paper receipts worked just as well as gold. In fact, they worked better because they were so much more convenient. Trade flourished. But then the goldsmiths, the very first bankers, got a clever and dangerous idea. They noticed people rarely came in to claim their actual gold. Most of the time, they just passed the paper receipts back and forth in the marketplace. On any given day, maybe only 10% of depositors would show up to redeem their receipts. So the goldsmith thought, what if I lend out some of this gold, just sitting in my vault? No one will ever know. I can charge interest and make a tidy profit. So he did. He loaned out some of the gold, but he soon realized he didn't even need to lend the actual gold. He could just issue more paper receipts than he had gold to back them. He could print a receipt looking exactly like all the others, lend it to a borrower, and no one would be the wiser. The borrower could then spend this new receipt in the marketplace. This was the birth of a secret science, creating money out of nothing. It's called fractional reserve banking. The gold in the vault is only a fraction of the paper receipts circulating in the economy. And here's where the magic trick happens. As long as everyone doesn't show up at once demanding their gold, the system works. But the moment public confidence shakes, the moment a rumor spreads that the goldsmith doesn't have the gold, you get what's called a run on the bank. Everyone rushes to the window simultaneously, and the illusion shatters. The goldsmith can't pay everyone, he's bankrupt. And the people last in line, they're holding worthless paper. This brings us back to those 7 men heading to Jekyll Island in 1910. They were the world's biggest bankers, the Morgans, the Rockefellers, the Warburgs, representatives of the Rothschild banking dynasty in Europe. They were competitors, yes, but they all shared the same terrifying problem, the instability of fractional reserve banking. In the years before 1910, America was experiencing financial panics. Bank runs were common. In the panic of 1907, hundreds of banks failed, wiping out thousands of ordinary people's savings. The bankers knew the system was inherently unstable. A single big bank failure could trigger a domino effect, bringing down the entire system. But they had other problems too. Competition was one. In the early 1900s, thousands of new, smaller banks were popping up, especially in the growing South and West. These new banks were chipping away at the big New York bankers' dominance. And Wall Street bankers didn't like competition. As John D. Rockefeller famously said, competition is a sin. Another problem was American industry becoming more independent. Companies were starting to finance their own growth from profits, instead of borrowing from banks. This was another trend the bankers wanted to reverse. They wanted businesses, and the government itself, dependent on them for capital. So on that secret Jekyll Island trip, these powerful men came together not to hunt ducks, but to solve these problems. Their goal was creating a banking cartel. A cartel is a group of businesses joining together to fix prices, eliminate competition, and share the market among themselves. But they knew they could never sell this to the American public. People were deeply suspicious of a money trust and a powerful central bank. They remembered Thomas Jefferson's warning, "I believe that banking institutions are more dangerous to our liberties than standing armies." So they had to be clever. They had to create a disguise. And that's exactly what they did over 9 days of secret meetings. They designed a creature and gave it a name that was a masterpiece of deception, the Federal Reserve System. Think about the name. Federal, it sounds like part of the government, doesn't it? But it isn't. The Federal Reserve is a private corporation, owned by the very commercial banks it's supposed to regulate. Reserve. It sounds safe, stable, like it has plenty of reserves. But as we learned from the goldsmiths, the entire system is built on only a fraction of reserves. System. It sounds decentralized, spread across the country, not concentrated in a few Wall Street bankers' hands. And they did create 12 regional Federal Reserve banks to give that appearance. But in reality, Power was, and still is, concentrated in the New York Fed and the Board of Governors in Washington. The plan they hatched on Jekyll Island had 5 main objectives. First, stop the competition from newer, smaller banks. The new system would impose regulations and reserve requirements much harder for small banks to meet, forcing many out of business or into mergers with bigger banks. Second, get a franchise to create money out of nothing for lending purposes. This is the heart of the plan. The Federal Reserve would be given legal power to do what the goldsmiths did, but on a massive, national scale. Third, get control of all banks' reserves. By pooling all banks' reserves into one central system, they could move money around to stop bank runs before they started. A bank in trouble in one city could be bailed out with reserves from another. It was a way to ensure the fractional reserve banking illusion would never be broken. Fourth, shift losses to taxpayers. This is perhaps the most brilliant part. Inevitably, banks would make bad loans. Under the old system, the bank's owners and stockholders would absorb those losses. Under the new system, when a big bank got in trouble, the Federal Reserve could step in as the, quote, lender of last resort, create new money from thin air, and bail the bank out. And who ultimately pays for this new money? The public, through a hidden tax called inflation. And the fifth, most important objective, convince Congress and the public that the whole scheme was designed to protect them. So, armed with this plan, the Jekyll Island group returned to New York. The plan was presented to Congress as the Aldrich Bill, named after Senator Nelson Aldrich. But they were smart. They knew Aldrich's name was too closely associated with Wall Street, so they put on a show. The big bankers, like Aldrich and Frank Vanderlip of National City Bank, publicly criticized the bill. They pretended to hate it. This was genius. It made the public and many politicians believe that if the big bankers were against it, it must be good for the common man. The bill was then given a few cosmetic changes, repackaged, and given to a group of Democrats to sponsor. It became the Glass-Owen Bill, which eventually passed into law as the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. William Jennings Bryan, a powerful Democrat who fiercely opposed the money trust, was tricked into supporting it. He was promised the new Federal Reserve notes would be government currency and the board would be appointed by the president. These were shadows, meaningless concessions. As President Woodrow Wilson later admitted to one of the bill's sponsors, "We can hold the substance of the thing and give the other fellow the shadow. Why not do it if we may save our bill?" And so, on December 23, 1913, while most of Congress was away for Christmas, the Federal Reserve Act was signed into law. The creature was born. Now, let's look at the magic trick at the heart of this system. Edward Griffin calls it the Mandrake mechanism, named after the comic strip magician who could create things from nothing. It's how the Federal Reserve, partnering with commercial banks, creates our entire money supply from debt. Here's how it works. Let's say the government needs $1 billion it doesn't have. It can't just print the money. That would be too obvious and alarm the public. Instead, it prints a piece of paper called a treasury bond. This is just a fancy IOU, a promise to pay back the $1 billion plus interest at some future point. The Treasury sends this bond to the Federal Reserve. The Fed takes the bond and writes a check to the Treasury for $1 billion. Now stop and think about this for a second. Where did the Fed get that $1 billion? It didn't have it. It just created it. It wrote a check against an account with no money in it. If you or I did that, we'd go to jail. But the Fed has legal right to do it. The government then deposits this check into its bank account and starts spending the money, paying soldiers, building roads, funding programs. This new $1 billion is now in the economy. But that's only the beginning of the magic trick. That $1 billion ends up in commercial banks as deposits. Now, because of fractional reserve banking, banks are only required to keep a fraction of that money on hand, let's say 10%. That means the bank has $900 million in excess reserves. And what can it do with those excess reserves? It can lend them out. But when it lends that $900 million, it doesn't take it from the original depositor's account. It creates new money, brand new checkbook money, for the borrower. And when that borrower spends that $900 million, it gets deposited into another bank, which then has $810 million in new excess reserves, 90% of $900 million, that it can lend out. This process continues again and again, like mirrors reflecting into infinity. That original $1 billion of government debt becomes the base for creating up to $9 billion of new money in the commercial banking system. So for every dollar of debt the government creates, the banking system creates up to 9 more. Our entire money supply is literally built on a foundation of debt. And here's the most mind-boggling part. If everyone in the country, the government, corporations, individuals, paid off all their debts, there would be no money. Not a single dollar would be left in circulation. Mariner Eccles, who was governor of the Federal Reserve in 1941, testified before Congress and said it plainly. When asked where the Fed got the money to buy government bonds, he said, "We created it, out of the right to issue credit money." A congressman then asked, "And there is nothing behind it, is there, except our government's credit?" Eccles replied, "That is what our money system is. If there were no debts in our money system, there wouldn't be any money." So you see, the Federal Reserve and the government aren't interested in you getting out of debt. They aren't interested in the government getting out of debt. The entire system requires perpetual debt to exist. And what's the reward for banks performing this magic trick? They get to collect interest on all this money they create from nothing. Every dollar in existence is earning interest for the banking cartel. A portion of every transaction, every profit, every salary, eventually makes its way back to the banks as interest. Griffin calls this the supreme instrument of usury, and the cost of this system, that hidden tax called inflation. When the money supply expands faster than the supply of goods and services, each dollar's value goes down. Prices don't go up. Your money's purchasing power goes down. Inflation is a tax, the most unfair tax of all, because it hurts the poor and elderly on fixed incomes the most. It silently confiscates the wealth of savers, the thrifty, the responsible. The Federal Reserve was sold to the public as a way to stabilize the economy and prevent booms and busts. But in reality, it's the very engine that creates them. By expanding and contracting the money supply at will, the Fed creates these artificial cycles. First, it makes credit cheap and easy, creating a speculative boom. Then, when things get out of hand, it tightens credit, triggering the bust. The Great Depression of the 1930s is a perfect example. In the 1920s, the Federal Reserve, under the direction of its New York Governor Benjamin Strong, one of the Jekyll Island men, embarked on a policy of easy credit and low interest rates. This wasn't to help the American economy, it was to help Great Britain. Britain's economy was struggling after World War I, and gold was flowing out of the Bank of England to the United States. To stop this, the Fed deliberately inflated the American money supply to make American investments less attractive and push gold back across the Atlantic. This flood of easy money in the U.S. spilled into the stock market, creating the Roaring Twenties and a massive speculative bubble. People were borrowing money to buy stocks on margin, convinced the party would never end. It was a national case of tulip mania. But the insiders knew it couldn't last. In February 1929, Paul Warburg, another Jekyll Island veteran, warned his fellow bankers, "If the orgies of unrestrained speculation are permitted to spread, the ultimate collapse is certain not only to affect the speculators themselves, but to bring about a general depression involving the entire country." The insiders, the Morgans, the Rockefellers, Joseph Kennedy, Bernard Baruch, all quietly exited the market. They sold their stocks near the top and converted their wealth into cash and gold. Meanwhile, the public was being told everything was fine. President Coolidge and Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon were assuring everyone the economy was fundamentally sound. Then, in August 1929, the Federal Reserve pricked the bubble. It raised the discount rate and began selling securities to contract the money supply. The easy credit dried up. The stock market began to slide. On October 29th, Black Tuesday, the market collapsed. Billions of dollars of paper wealth vanished in a single day. The small investors, the public, were wiped out. And who was there to buy up the wreckage? The insiders who had preserved their cash. They came back into the market and bought up stocks and entire companies for pennies on the dollar. Some of the greatest fortunes in America were consolidated during the very depression the Fed had created. It was, as one observer put it, the calculated shearing of the public by the world money powers. The story doesn't end there. It gets bigger. As G. Edward Griffin shows, the same forces that created the Federal Reserve have also shaped world events, particularly wars. He proposes what he calls the Rothschild formula, a strategy for profiting from perpetual conflict. The formula is simple. War is the ultimate discipline for a government. In wartime, a nation will borrow any amount of money to survive. Therefore, to ensure governments are always in debt to the bankers, you must ensure they're always at war or preparing for war. This means you must have credible enemies. If enemies don't exist, they must be created, and often this means financing both sides of a conflict. Let's look at World War I. Before the U.S. entered the war, the House of Morgan was the official agent for selling British and French war bonds in America. Billions of dollars were raised. Most of that money was then spent in the U.S. on war supplies, with Morgan acting as purchasing agent and taking a commission. Morgan-controlled companies got the lucrative contracts. It was an incredibly profitable loop. But by 1917, the Allies were losing the war. Germany's U-boats were strangling Great Britain. The Allied war bonds were becoming worthless. Morgan and the other bankers stood to lose a fortune. The only way to save their loans was for the United States to enter the war. But the American people were overwhelmingly against it. President Wilson had just won re-election on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." So a pretext was needed. Something dramatic, something emotional that would turn public opinion. That pretext was the sinking of the Lusitania. The Lusitania was a British passenger liner, but it was also secretly carrying a massive cargo of munitions for the British war effort, purchased and arranged by J.P. Morgan. The German embassy in Washington knew this, and even placed ads in New York newspapers warning Americans not to travel on the ship. The U.S. State Department suppressed most of these ads. On May 7, 1915, as the Lusitania entered waters off the Irish coast, her British naval escort, the Juno, was ordered to return to port by none other than Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty. The ship was ordered to reduce speed, making it an easy target. A German U-boat was known to be in the area. The trap was set. The U-boat fired a single torpedo. After the initial impact, a massive second explosion from within, caused by the secret munitions, tore the ship apart. It sank in 18 minutes. 195 people died, including 128 Americans. The public was outraged. A wave of anti-German hysteria, fanned by the press, swept the country. 2 years later, America entered the war. The first thing Congress did was authorize billions in credit to the Allies. The money was created by the Federal Reserve. The first payments went directly to Morgan to cover British debts. The war was financed by the American people through the hidden tax of inflation. And the bankers' loans were saved. An even more shocking story is the financing of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. The revolution that brought the communists to power was not a popular uprising. It was a coup d'état, planned and financed by outsiders. Some money came from Germany, but a great deal came from Wall Street and London financiers. Jacob Schiff, head of Kuhn, Loeb & Company in New York, admitted to spending about $20 million, an immense sum at the time, for the triumph of communism in Russia. Leon Trotsky, one of the revolution's leaders, was living in New York before returning to Russia. His expenses were paid by wealthy backers. When he was arrested by Canadian authorities in Halifax, on his way to Russia, it was pressure from high-level British and American officials, including President Wilson's advisor, Colonel House, that secured his release. Why would the world's biggest capitalists finance their supposed mortal enemies, the communists? Griffin argues it was an application of the Rothschild formula. The goal wasn't to promote communism, but to gain control over the vast resources of the Russian Empire. By funding all sides, the Bolsheviks, their rivals the Mensheviks, and even the anti-communist forces, they ensured whoever came out on top would be indebted to them. An American Red Cross mission was sent to Russia in 1917. But it wasn't a humanitarian mission. It was, in the words of one of its members, nothing but a mask. It was led by William Boyce Thompson, a director of the New York Federal Reserve Bank and a Wall Street magnate. The mission was packed with financiers and lawyers who, under the guise of the Red Cross, were negotiating profitable commercial concessions from the new Bolshevik government. They secured monopolies on asbestos and manganese and gained control of oil fields and other resources. And in the years that followed, this pattern continued. The West, led by Wall Street and Washington, built the Soviet Union's industrial and military machine. Lenin himself said, "The capitalists will extend credits which will strengthen for us the Communist Party, and giving us the materials and technology we lack, they will restore our military industry." In other words, they will labor for the preparation of their own suicide. The financing of enemies wasn't a mistake, it was a strategy. By building a credible enemy, the Cold War was sustained for decades, justifying massive military budgets, perpetual debt, and a world balanced on the edge of terror, all of which was immensely profitable for the banking cartel and solidified the power of the political class. This brings us to the final, most chilling part of the plan, the New World Order. The ultimate goal of this international network of financiers, Griffin argues, isn't just to control individual nations, but to create a single, global system of financial and political control, a world government. This system is being built piece by piece through international organizations like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, which were created at the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944. These institutions, like the Fed, function as a world central bank, creating world currency from nothing and using loans to bring the world's governments under their control. The strategy is to merge the world's nations, gradually eroding their national sovereignty. This is being done through regional groupings like the European Union and the North American Free Trade Agreement. These aren't just trade agreements. They're stepping stones toward world government. And how will the American people be convinced to give up their independence and merge into this global system? By weakening the United States. Through foreign aid, crippling debt, deindustrialization, and endless regulations, the American economy is being deliberately brought down to the level of other nations. The goal is to create a crisis, an economic collapse, an environmental catastrophe, or the threat of a new war, so severe that the American people will welcome a rescue from a world government. Griffin points to a document called the Report from Iron Mountain, a think tank study from the 1960s, which concluded that war was the only reliable way to control a society. But in a future world government, war between nations would be impossible, so a substitute for war would be needed. The report considered several options, but the most promising, it concluded, was the threat of global environmental disaster. By convincing people that humanity itself is the enemy, that our modern way of life is destroying the planet, a new kind of war could be declared, a war to save the Earth. This war would justify the same things a military war does: high taxes, rationing, loss of freedom, and submission to a global authority. This, Griffin argues, is the hidden agenda behind the modern environmental movement. It's not about saving the planet. It's about creating the psychological pretext for world government. So where does this leave us? The picture G. Edward Griffin paints is a dark one. It's a world where our reality has been shaped by a small group of men with a hidden agenda, where money is an illusion, debt is a trap, war is a business, and freedom is slowly being replaced by a sophisticated, high-tech form of feudalism. It's a pessimistic view, to be sure, but it's also a call to arms. When you first encounter the ideas in The Creature from Jekyll Island, it's easy to feel overwhelmed. It can feel like you've been shown a secret blueprint for the world that turns everything you thought you knew upside down. The story is so vast, so audacious, that the first reaction for many is disbelief. It sounds like a conspiracy theory. But G. Edward Griffin doesn't ask you to believe him blindly. He presents mountains of evidence, quoting bankers, politicians, and historians. He connects the dots from a secret meeting in 1910 to today's headlines. And whether you agree with all his conclusions or not, the journey he takes you on forces you to ask fundamental questions. Why is our government perpetually in debt? Why does our money's purchasing power always seem to decline? Why do we lurch from one economic crisis to another? Why do we seem to find ourselves drawn into endless conflicts around the world? The book's most powerful lesson, for me, is realizing our monetary system isn't a natural phenomenon like the weather. It was designed, and if something is designed, it can be understood, and if it can be understood, it can be changed. This isn't a message of despair, it's a message of empowerment. The first step in solving any problem is understanding you have one. And this book, more than any other, pulls back the curtain on the biggest financial problem of all. So what can you, as a young person just starting out in the world, do with this knowledge? First, and most importantly, educate yourself. Don't stop here. Read. Question. Learn about history, economics, and politics from sources outside the mainstream. The greatest defense against deception is a well-informed mind. Second, get out of debt and stay out of debt. Understanding how money is created from debt should make you allergic to it. In a system designed to trap people in debt, the most revolutionary act you can commit is being financially independent. Live within your means, save your money, and invest wisely in things with real, tangible value. Third, share this knowledge. The system we have today only exists because so few people understand it. The creators of the Federal Reserve counted on the public being mentally incapable of comprehending it. Let's prove them wrong. Talk to your friends, family, teachers, start conversations. A population that understands the magic trick can no longer be fooled by it. Griffin ends his book with a realistic scenario. He doesn't promise an easy future. The forces we're up against are powerful, and there's a difficult road ahead. But he believes the creature can be slain. And how? He says it will be slain by piercing it with 1,000,000 lances of truth, wielded by 1,000,000 crusaders with determination and courage. That crusade begins with you. It begins with the decision to no longer be a passive spectator in the unfolding of history, but to become an active, informed, and responsible citizen. The future isn't set. It will be what we choose to make it. And the first step in choosing a better future is understanding the forces that have shaped our present. That was a deep dive into the core ideas of The Creature from Jekyll Island by G. Edward Griffin. We've journeyed from secret meetings to battlefields and uncovered the hidden mechanics of our financial world. But let's be clear, this summary is just the map. The real treasure is found when you explore the territory yourself. A book like this is more than just information. It's an experience. It's filled with details, stories, and connections we just couldn't cover today. If any part of this story sparked your curiosity or made you look at the world a little differently, then I truly encourage you to pick up a copy. Reading it isn't just about learning facts. It's about equipping yourself with a new lens to see the world. And that's a power that can stay with you for a lifetime. The link to the book is in the description below. And finally, if this journey into one of the most powerful books on the billionaire's bookshelf has been valuable to you, please take a moment to click that subscribe button and give this video a like. It tells us you want more deep dives like this, and it helps our community of curious minds grow. We have so many more life-changing books to explore together. Let's keep learning, let's keep questioning, and let's keep growing. Thank you for joining me.